Greetings, Culture Warriors. It is I, Jeff Vieira, the author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest dispatch from the front. No story to kick off today. This will be one of those podcast episodes where we just summarize a concept based on many, many threads going on out there in our culture today, both in business and in the general political climate. But today I want to talk to you about shame. Shame. Shame has a very important cultural function because shame is the main way that we assure compliance to a culture. So when we think about this in business terms, I spent a number of years going back and forth to Asia. And the Asian business climate is interesting because, of course, it adopts the Eastern cultural flavor of the area in which it is found. And one of the more noticeable aspects of Eastern culture is the concept of face and shame. One must save face. That's the dignity, the respect that you've acquired over the course of a lifetime, reflected in the position of responsibility you've been given. And so you see interesting phenomenon in, say, Japan, when something happens that shouldn't have happened, and you see the usually stoic leader of the organization impacted do something absolutely remarkable, something that you almost never see in the West. They appear before the people that they lead and they offer a tearful and abject apology, often followed by a profound bow that has great cultural resonance because it is not the way that they normally bow when interacting with someone of an inferior position, where they just kind of bow slightly in acknowledgement of the inferior's profound bow. No, this is a profound bow. Sometimes getting down on their hands and knees to do so when the offense is particularly egregious. And you can't help but, as a Westerner, feel uncomfortable witnessing such a thing and wondering what on earth would make them go that far. And the answer is shame and face. When they have lost face to that degree, they are effectively broken and deeply, deeply ashamed. And the ticket for readmittance into society is to make the humblest and most abject of apologies. And that is why they do it, often with tears streaming down their face at the blow to ego and pride that represents, at the deep sorrow that their actions have brought them to this. It is truly remarkable to see. Now, I say that almost never happens in the West, but the truth is it's becoming more common. You see this on social media now fairly often. And that is when someone says something which is not politically correct, and a mob is assembled against them, they will make sometimes, often these days, a similar tearful public apology. You may remember a few weeks ago, quarterback of the New Orleans Saints, Drew Brees, who had been a fixture in his community, donated millions, for example, in support of Katrina relief after Hurricane Katrina flooded the city of New Orleans and made so many homeless. Well, Drew Brees made the mistake of saying something politically incorrect and indicating that he did not stand four square with the interests of the radical Marxist group Black Lives Matter, for example. And then, despite all the millions Drew Brees had given, all the time that he and his family had personally spent helping African Americans in particular in Louisiana and elsewhere, all that went out the window in an instant. And suddenly, Drew Brees was an outsider. The famed quarterback of the most beloved sports franchise in town was an outsider, and people started speculating that perhaps he should retire. So Drew Brees, the terrific professional athlete, the future Hall of Famer, undisputed leader of the New Orleans Saints, Drew Brees made an abject apology in public for his apostasy. Now, mind you, this was the same New Orleans Saints who a number of years ago were wrapped up in an event called Bounty Gate, where a number of their coaches were credibly accused of having paid to have players injure players on opposing teams. It's a big no-no in the NFL. In the broader athletic world, you could not really be more unsportsmanlike than that. And yet, Sean Payton, head coach, never offered a tearful apology. But Drew Brees had to. And the reason is very simple. Drew Brees had to be shamed because Drew Brees gave an indication that you could have an opinion that went against the wishes of your politically correct masters. So shame was invoked, along with threats of violence and other things, in order to trigger that abject apology, which further reinforced the notion that anyone who would say such things should be deeply, deeply ashamed and had no place in our society. Now, this is relatively new in Western culture, because with the exception of, say, our apostasy from religion, we haven't had that many instances where this kind of public shaming was pulled off. You can think, for example, of the Puritans when they first came to this country, and some of the settlements that they had featured a pillory. And a pillory, you can see it sometimes if you go to the historical parks, consisted of a place you would be on your knees. It's important for you to be on your knees. That's shaming. You would put your head and your wrists into these circles. There was a hinge in the device, so it kind of split along the semicircle. And they would lift it up. You would lay your wrists in, then put your head in. They would close the rest of it about you, so your neck is encircled, your wrists are encircled. They would lock it, and you would be left out there for a couple of days. And passers-by would spit on you, hurl profanity at you, throw rotten fruit at you, because your crimes were typically hung around your neck and written on a piece of wood or something similar, so people knew why you were in the pillory. So if you were publicly drunk, if you skipped church on Sunday, whatever the case was, they knew what your crime was, and you were in a public square where everyone could see you, and everyone passing by going to market had to see you. And you would just sit there and take it while they hurled their abuse at you until your time was up. They let you out and you could return to your rather diminished place in society, knowing that you would probably never recommit whatever offense had landed you in there in the first place. So aside from those kind of situations, we even had one where you had a Roman emperor who had to kneel in the snow begging to re-enter the church and do his public penance before he could. So while in the West, we do have some history of shame, of shame being used so powerfully. These are very, they're noted for their exceptions rather than being the rule. It was rather on the fringes of things, if you will. And it mainly came down to the impact upon one's reputation. A criminal penalty such as thumb branding has its impact only if your reputation matters. So if you see someone who has a brand on their thumb indicating they were a thief or some sort, then in a society where a lot of stock is placed on reputation, it has the consequence of really limiting what you can do socially. In a society where that doesn't matter, well, it has no impact at all, right? Seems like a rather silly thing to do. But for much of our history in the West, reputation did matter. Perhaps not quite as much as it did in the East, but nonetheless, to the point where we had a dueling culture where one would avenge slights to one's reputation by dueling with saber or with pistol in order to rectify the situation. So they took reputation fairly seriously. Shame certainly was used in those cases, but it was more so from a religious aspect, more so from a family aspect than the kind of public shaming that we're seeing now for political aberration. That comes to us from the communist world. You'll recall in the days of Stalin, in the days of Mao, that they would have these show trials. And the purpose of a show trial, a mockery of Western justice, was not to determine the guilt or innocence of the accused. Their guilt had already been predetermined. The purpose of the show trial was for the convicted to confess to the broader society what they were told to confess, regardless of whether they had anything to do with it, in hopes of being spared the firing squad or the gallows. And so they would process forward, claim whatever they were told to claim, point the finger at whomever they were told to point the finger at. And it would be this big spectacle, this propaganda coup for the ruling regime, because it reinforced the lies that they had previously told. You see, there was a doctor's plot. Aha! these people who you thought were moral men and dissidents were involved. They're plotting against our government. They're traitors. The regime would get what it wanted out of these spectacles. And only rarely would somebody deviate from the plot whereupon the feed would be cut and the damage contained, usually by silencing that person forever. If you want a full account of this kind of system, you can read Solzhenitsyn, especially the Gulag Archipelago. And it's a disturbing and fascinating read, but that's where this latter-day notion of the public apology comes from. And sadly, the people who have been canceled, who in their desperation come out and confess to all manner of thought crime, to use Orwell's word, well, they find that while the immediate pressure relents in the wake of their very public apology, that they're never admitted back into the good graces of the society which shamed them. They're always shunned. They're always suspect. The difference is that the mob shuffles off to find another target. Better to stand up to them, to not apologize, to stand for what you stand for. But few have the courage to do that. The potency of shame is simply too much for many. Now, that's not to say that this is always and everywhere a bad thing. Simply because it's having a toxic effect in our culture today doesn't mean that it's not appropriate within our businesses for the greater good to leverage some of that power in a more humane way in order to help our cultures thrive. So, for example, if within your culture you have customer focus as one of your core values, and you run into a situation where someone, out of their own misplaced sense of fairness, for example, refuses to treat the customer well. They get into an adversarial conflict with the customer. It's okay to leverage the power of shame to correct that. Now, should it be done in public in front of everyone? No, not unless it's a particularly egregious offense, whereupon that person should probably be let go anyway, and the culture thereby reinforced. But certainly in private, having a word about why the customer is so important to us and how we need to keep that forefront in our mind, well, that can be very effective. You should feel a little bit badly if you're working with customers and you're electing to treat them as the enemy. Some amount of shame is warranted in that. You're not doing your job. You're not following the purpose of the organization. And if you don't like that, ultimately you should leave. No one's forcing you to stay. We talk a little bit about sporting culture from time to time. And on some teams, they run their sports in a very business-like fashion. They put a big premium on following through on your responsibility. Do your job. If on a given play you were supposed to do X, do X to the best of your ability. Do your job. When I was coming up through high school football, we used to have a phrase for those people who were taking it easy in practice. There was a phenomenon in a lot of football practices where you would have sprints at the end of practice to kind of keep the conditioning up, get the heart rate back up and going after you'd walk through a bunch of plays, etc. And practice wouldn't end until you run a number of these sprints. And often the coaches would praise those teammates who won, and in various, there would usually be a line of say 3. When they blew the whistle and you ran the sprint, you get praised for if you won out of the 3 crossing the line at the end, etc. And so some people figured out early on that since you're going to run a bunch of these, it made sense to take it easy on the first ones and then put out full effort only on the last one, which kind of defeated the purpose of what the coach was trying to do. It was part of conditioning. They wanted you running full out the whole time. And so we had a phrase for that. It was called dogging it. You would dog it in practice like a lazy dog. You would take it easy. You would take plays off. You wouldn't give your full effort. And it meant a couple of things. It meant, one, that you were kind of defeating the purpose of whatever we were doing at the time. 2, it was a form of cheating because you wanted to look good in the end. And 3, it was really a way of letting your teammates down. And you had to wonder, if someone was dogging in practice, how were they going to be in the game? Were they going to take it easy in the game too when we needed them? So we used to call it dogging it. And that was a way of shaming people who were taking a break when they were supposed to be performing. And you'd hear people say, don't dog it. Hey, quit dogging it. It was part of the culture. So in a lot of teams, you have that in order to kind of keep the performance level high and up. And that's fine. You've got everybody, you're aspiring to full effort, to get better, to work hard, and by working hard to get stronger. So that's fine. Now, it doesn't feel good in the moment if you happen to be the person being targeted for that. But to an extent, it's your own fault too. So it's a relatively painless way of getting back in the fold. So I encourage us as we look at our own cultures and we think of the behaviors that we're looking for, is to consider how we can use that powerful weapon to get our culture reinforced and better lived. And again, you have to be careful because we're not interested in having show trials. We don't want to do this in a way that tyrannical regimes do. You don't want to be, in the current pandemic terms, a Karen, which is someone who, seeing an alleged deviance from whatever people are being told to do at the moment, decides to enforce it as though they were an appointed deputy. And through their derision and through their ever-present phone, I will record you in your apostasy, and I will show this to someone in authority, an expert of some sort. And then you'll see, yes, you'll see. That's not what we're looking for in our business lives. What we are looking for is, for example, if you're walking through a warehouse and you see a number of teammates walk by and the same piece of paper or packing tape sitting there on the floor, you pick it up and you put it in the nearest bin. And if you see someone wandering by repeatedly ignoring it, you might point out to them, hey, why did you walk by that? That's all. We all want to have a clean environment, a safe environment, and it requires us all to do our part, which means, hey, if you're walking through and things are busy and you see stuff, bend over and pick it up. If you see someone doing something unsafe, say something and help them out. little things that can be done to reinforce the behaviors that we want to see in our culture. If, for example, you have a culture of mutual respect, etc., and you notice someone is dropping F-bombs all the time, then have a word about language. Put in place that jar where everyone who drops a curse word has to put $1 in the jar, and then we all use it to go to lunch or something. There are subtle ways of using the power of shame to reinforce our culture. But be careful. Shame, of course, is a negative thing, in part. It is much better to praise than to shame. And so if you find people who do the right things, even if they do it inconsistently, not all the time, not particularly well sometimes, then you praise them for what they do. Because love, in the end, is more powerful than fear. And shame is fear-based. It's the fear of not being part of the crowd. And while in the moment that can be a powerful thing, over time, the more we resort to that powerful weapon, the worse people feel. And if shame has to be resorted to with the same person multiple times, if they're put in the pillory constantly, a deep resentment grows towards that society, towards that culture. You want to be careful not to ignite a revolution in the process. So that's today's topic, a word about shame. Have a great day.